Hi there, folks. In this video we're going to have a look at a can of vintage reloading powder. This particular powder is Hercules Reloader 11. You can see the R11 sticker on the top. This is not a standard can of Reloader 11 if you ever found an old can of that around. This is repackaged stuff. There's a Canadian company which still exists today. They're called Higginson Powders. And before that they were called Ammo Mart, and before that they were called this company, XL Explosives. And this company got its start selling blasting and mining explosives to the mining and construction industry. So one of the other things they did was import powder from mostly from American suppliers back in that day, and also some British powders as well. They would import them in bulk and then repackage them in these smaller cans. So this stuff is, you know, like I said, this is pretty old. It's probably from about 1965 to 1970 is probably about as new as it could be. It could be potentially older than that. Obviously, there's always some concerns with older powder if it's still usable and safe. The first thing you want to check is the smell of the powder. Powder which is decomposing has an extremely nasty acidic smell off it. Not like the normal smell of perhaps ether you would get off a can of powder, but a really horribly noxious smell. It's unmistakable if you've ever smelt it. Hopefully you never do. If you come across a can of powder that has that acidic smell off it, you will almost always find that the can is heavily corroded as well. And if you should come across powder like that, dispose of it immediately. Don't leave it around. It becomes a bit of a safety hazard when it gets to that point. And it will also cause everything in the immediate vicinity to corrode as well because of the decomposition. This powder is still good. There's no nasty smell off it. The inside of the can is not rusty. There's a little bit of gray on the inside of the can probably from the graphite coating used on the powder. And to check it further, of course, we're going to pour some out into a container, and you'll notice that there's no dust, no big cloud of reddish dust coming off it, because sometimes when powder breaks down it will leave a reddish dust, which may be from the inside of the can corroding. But in this case, excuse me, the powder is in good condition. It doesn't have any bad smell off it, and there's no dust coming off the powder. The inside of the can is not corroded. So let's just show you up close what this Reloader 11 looks like. You can see there's a small red identifier in there. This is an extruded, short-grained, small diameter type of powder. I'm not sure if it's single or double base, but really doesn't make a lot of difference to us at this point in time anyway. So that's what the powder looks like. It should measure pretty well through a powder measure because of its small grain size. So once you've come across an old can of powder and you've determined that it's safe, you may or may not decide to use it. A lot of times if you go online, people will say, oh, just throw the powder away, it could be dangerous, blah blah blah. I'm not really in favor of disposing of usable components. If they're still usable, I think they could be put to some good use. It's not the kind of powder that I would load up ammunition that I was going to take to a match or something, but for just sort of plinking at the range type stuff, this type of powder can be usable. And I mean, if it's still good, why not use it, right? So once you've determined that the powder is in fact suitable for use, we are going to need some reloading data for it. And if you go looking for reloading data for Reloader 11 powder, you're going to be disappointed in the modern sources. You won't find anything in the way of online data, and in fact you have to go back to some pretty old manuals to find some reloading data. This is a Spear book from 1966. How's that for a vintage wholesome cover there? Father and son loading some ammo. Anyway, we do have data in this for Reloader 11 for various cartridges. Apparently it's quite a good powder for 30-30 Winchester. Anyway, I decided I would use it in 223 because I have a Remington 700, which is a good, accurate, strong rifle, and I can try some loads with that powder in that rifle. So if we look at the data for 223, and I was interested in 55 grain data, we have these of course would be Spear bullets. We have data for Reloader 11, there you can see it right there, and it goes in charges from 23 to 25 grains with velocities from 3041 to 3272. It's been my experience with older powders that generally they will give you less performance than the book will tell you, and that's probably because they have gotten a little bit weaker with age. But the worst thing that can happen with these powders is that they are too weak when they get old to be usable, which is why I would recommend trying a few loads before you assemble any great quantity. If for some reason they are too, the powder's too weak, well then by all means, dispose of it at that point in time. But I think it's fair enough to give it a try. So, by way of projectiles for this, we're going to be using some of these Sierras. I got these at a gun show. You can see this was an open box, so this is going to make for some cheap shooting. This was an open box with 93 bullets in it. So these are 55 grain Spitzers, which are close enough to the spear ones that I think I can safely substitute the Sierra for the spear. I'll use the overall length data from the Sierra book instead of the data from this. Anyway, I'm going to put a few of those together, just using some pickup brass from the range, some of that stuff that you find everywhere. So I think that's the Federal, sort of the military style load. All kinds of that on the range. So I'm going to be using that. And next thing you see, we'll be at the range and we'll try some of these for accuracy and velocity over the chronograph. Well, I'm out at the range today and I'm trying out some 223 reloads with that old Reloader 11 powder. So I got two different loads done up, one with 24 grains and one with 23, and we'll try those over the chronograph and see how they do for velocity. They are all loaded with the 55 grain Sierra semi-point soft point bullet. So let's see how those do. Alright, here's the 23 grain load. There's the brass. You can see the primers are nice and round still. These are with a Dominion brand primer, which is Russian. Didn't get that many readings considering I fired 10, but here's what we got. There's our low, high, average, extreme spread, standard deviation, and we only got 6 out of the 10 shots. So these are pretty slow. So let's go down and have a look at the target. So this is the first 5-round group with the 23 grain charge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's quite low. It's even lower than the last round I was loading, which was also low velocity. I'll only be printing up here. Anyway, and we got another one up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Also not bad. A little bit of stringing going on there, but pretty reasonable. Alright, next up we're going to try the 24 grain charge. Alright, chronograph readings with the 24 grain charge. These are low, high, average, extreme spread, standard deviation, and got 8 out of 10 shots as readings. Still pretty slow though. Alright, I'm back home from the range. I figured I'd measure the 24 grain charges, the groups here at home, and we'll have a little closer look at the 23 grain charges because I had a chance to actually measure the groups up a little more accurately. So here's one of those groups with the 23 grain charge, and you can see that it measures 0.85 of an inch, which is pretty good. And here's the other group here with the 23 grain charge. It's 0.81 of an inch, so also not too bad. Those groups could have been made a little better had I kept my head stuck down on the stock, but I of course was checking the brass and the primers in between shots just to look for pressure signs, so I probably could have shaved a bit off that had I just kept my head stuck to the stock and fired the shots without moving around so much. Anyway, so onward to the 24 grain charge groups. So we fired 2 groups on this target here, and I just stuck on a couple of extra aiming points to shoot those groups. So here's one that's a little bit bigger. This one is 1.03 inches for center to center, which is how all these are measured. And then we have our best group of the day, which was the last one with the 24 grain charge, and that is 0.55 of an inch, so not quite under a half inch, but getting pretty close to it. And once again, I think these groups could have been improved on a bit had I been just keeping my head stuck down to the stock and not moving around and checking the brass and this and that and the other thing. So that doesn't exactly help your group sizes when you move around so much between shots. But we were mostly concerned about getting some velocity figures, and then seeing how they shot was sort of secondary after that. As to the velocity obtained, you'll note that the speeds were lower than the book speeds that we saw earlier in the reloading handbook, and that's not surprising with old powder. That's been my experience. Old powder generally seems to give you a little less performance than you would get with a fresher powder. So considering that this powder was probably free, I think somebody just gave me the can of it. I think one of the guys at the ski club came up to me one day and said, "Oh, do you want this can of old powder?" And of course the thing to say is, "Yes, please." So the powder was free. It makes for some interesting experimenting with old powders, and free is good, and a little bit of knowledge gained by trying some of these old things out rather than just throwing them away. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.